Hello and welcome to ThreatWise TV. I'm Hazel Burton. Today, the hills will be alive with the smell of Snort as we meet two of Cisco Talos' researchers who specialize in this free open source tool that we provide. They are responsible for writing new Snort signatures and ensuring that our customers are protected from the latest vulnerabilities and zero-day attacks. Plus, we've researched some interesting data about what Snort is seeing on Cisco Secure Firewall appliances, which gives us a strong indication of what tactics and tools bad actors are currently using. Now, for anyone who's never heard of Snort, beyond seeing one of these little squidgy fellas on our conference stands and demanding to know, where's the gold one? Please allow my colleagues Nick and Brandon to tell you all about Snort.
Well, Snort is an intrusion detection and or prevention system. So when you set up Snort, you set it up inline or passive in your network. And from there, you can use it to actively monitor network traffic and or drop, modify, or inject traffic into your network.
It not only can sniff passively on a network, but as Nick said, that it can block traffic and modify traffic inline. So if it detects an attack using a Snort rule, then we can block the attack before it's ever seen by the vulnerable application, preventing the attack. And Snort is an open source project. So we're on GitHub, and we're also a product within Cisco. Cisco Secure Firewall uses Snort 3 as its engine, a detection engine. So we're running the same software.
So what does the Snort process look like? For example, if you're a Cisco Secure customer and you have one of our firewalls, how does Snort work with the firewall to ultimately add greater levels of protection for your organization?
So it obviously begins with data coming into your network, right? And then we're going to do some basic pre-processing, which is their decoding. And we're going to decode some basic protocol information, such as like important fields of information with IP headers and things like that. And next, we're going to do something a little more complicated with like TCP stream reassembly. And that way we put together a bunch of data coming through your network into one singular view that we can see as a rule writer and we can detect malicious traffic on. And from there, we're going to do some more post-processing for higher level protocols like HTTP. It's probably a real familiar one. And then we'll deliver a verdict and log it and send it to you for action.
We'll have a codec that knows the wire layer 2 protocol, and then we'll pass that on up to inspectors. So the HB inspector is a very important inspector within Snort. Allows us to take a look at HB 1 and 2 protocol fields and populate buffers. And then the rules can look at those buffers. They'll scan those buffers for malicious data. If we find something malicious with a rule, then we can block not only the pseudo packet, but also in line with before the segment even reaches the victim or the host that's being targeted with the attack, preventing the attack.
At Cisco Talos, we investigate software and operating system vulnerabilities in order to discover them before the malicious threat actors do. We provide this information to vendors so that they can create patches and protect their customers as soon as possible. We're currently discovering 1 zero-day for every working day. So that's over 200 zero days every year. So how does Snort help in the case of a zero-day attack?
Well, I think Snort plays a really important role when it comes to zero days specifically, because obviously when we find out about a zero day, obviously we spin up kind of like a task force that we get a bunch of people on board and everyone takes a role in how we're going to deal with it, right? And our goal is immediately when a zero day happens, we want to build and release a Snort, build that day and get rules out to the customers. And the thing is why Snort is super important in that aspect is that when you have a product that's vulnerable, it's really hard, especially if you have a ton of them, let's say like a bunch of Windows computers, it's really hard to patch all of those in a very fast amount of time. And Snort, we deliver one rule, it gets onto your sensor and it gets dropped before it ever hits a computer or a server.
So a lot of times, no rule update is necessary. We may block the payload of the zero day. It may be a class of vulnerability that's very easy to detect generically. So no real specialized rule may be necessary in order to block it. But like Nick said, we spin up a task force, we take a look at the attack anyway, and then if rules are necessary, we get those out as soon as possible.
We also publish the information about Snort rules on the Talos blog in the case of any zero-day incident. So be sure to subscribe to blog.talosintelligence.com if you haven't already. Now, digging deeper into this topic, what kind of vulnerabilities tend to trigger the most Snort signatures?
If you're talking about recent attacks, Log4j or Log4j attacks are a very interesting one, because attackers were just basically spraying these Log4j templates in every single protocol field of an HTTP request, just looking for an application that logged one of those fields to get popped. And so we would see these attacks just constantly all over the world on our sensors. And once we had those signatures in place, it was just a matter of taking a look at who the attackers were and blocklisting them and monitoring the infections and making sure that we communicated with customers what was going on. But really, Snort gave us all that visibility where there was none before. And I think we were able to put up a really good response for that attack. So HTTP requests, attacks, drive-by compromise, stuff like that, those are very popular.
The quantity of attacks we see the most commonly is it's attacks that are very easy to execute. We certainly obviously still have rules to detect more complex attacks, but the most prominent thing is going to be something that someone can fire off at every IP on the internet and compromise the most amount of devices in the smallest amount of time.
Let's spend some time on that topic and talk about what kind of fruit is currently most tempting to attackers. Around 18 months ago, we looked at what Snort was seeing on Cisco Secure Firewall appliances. Given the rapid changes that can take place in the threat landscape, we decided to revisit the data to see how the landscape has shifted. So let's dig into the data with Ben Nahorny and find out. First of all, here is how Ben approached the data.
We approached this data in much the same way we did the first time, only we looked at a time period covering January through December of 2022. So when looking at this data then, if a rule triggers at a particular organization, we're counting that organization only once. This does two things. First, it reduces noise from very active rules, things like DOS attacks, where you can get rule alert after rule after rule alert. And secondly, we can say then that X% of organizations encountered a particular rule.
Now, let's hear about the first big find in the data that Ben looked at.
Well, it probably comes as no surprise that Log4j was everywhere in 2022. In fact, 72% of organizations had Log4j Snort rules alert on their firewalls at least once at some point in the year. Now, of those organizations that saw alerts, the typical organization saw around 110 Log4j alerts each month. Now, this roughly translates to about 3 to 4 attempts each day.
3 or 4 times a day? Give it up, Log4j. She's not going to call you back. So what else did the data reveal about the vulnerabilities that were being heavily exploited in 2022?
Turns out that many of the rules that we saw last time around, they're still prevalent today. Vulnerabilities in PHP unit, JBoss, a variety of routers, along with the shell shock vulnerability, all made repeat appearances this time around. Now, one entry worth mentioning is the Spring for Shell vulnerability in the Java Spring framework. While this was also a flaw in a widely used library, it was only really exploitable under very specific conditions. But based on our Snort telemetry, bad actors are clearly trying to exploit it, since almost half of all organizations had alerts for it.
Given the prevalence of Log4j, a new-ish vulnerability, at least comparatively speaking, we decided to look at if newer vulnerabilities in general were being exploited more frequently now than they were the last time we investigated this data 18 months ago.
For the time period that we looked at in 2021, we identified 21% of CVEs we looked at were new. In comparison, 30% of the CVEs were identified as new over the same time frame in 2022.
Now, this gives the appearance that bad actors are trying out newer exploits than they were previously. Some of the new vulnerabilities seen are in applications such as Confluence, Apache HTTP Server, VMware, and Microsoft Exchange. An additional Spring Framework vulnerability also makes the list. Attackers in general look for the path of least resistance. They figure if a vulnerability hasn't been patched by now, it's probably not going to be, and therefore that is where I'm going to start. Now, Ben also looked at the attacks in the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and here's what he found in conjunction with the Snort data.
As we saw last time, Snort sees more initial access tactics than any other. This makes a lot of sense considering a firewall's usual placement at the perimeter of a network, and Log4j naturally played a big part. falling under the exploit public-facing applications technique. Execution tactics were the second most encountered tactic, thanks in part to Spring for Shell, as well as exploits in applications such as Drupal, WordPress, and Apache Struts. There were also a notable increase in command and control tactics, in part thanks to well-known threats such as Mirai, Ave Maria, Remcos, and Chopper.
Ben also explored which Snort categories saw the most alerts.
The server other category was the most commonly seen this time around, thanks to Log4j. But also server web app was quite regularly seen, thanks to many of the web applications we'd seen previously, along with 2 new entries for vulnerabilities in Apache HTTP servers and Microsoft Exchange servers. And also malware CNC category was one of those categories that we frequently saw this time around, thanks to activity from a variety of well-known threats, such as Mirai, Ave Maria, Remcos, and Chopper.
So bearing all of this in mind, what does this data tell us about the type of attacks that Snort is seeing?
Well, it's hard to ignore the impact that Log4j has had, as this series of exploits has just dominated in 2022. And since attackers still regularly deploy years-old vulnerabilities, it's likely we're going to be seeing Log4j for many years to come. And finally, addressing initial access attempts made against public-facing applications is probably the most important tactic and technique to address here. While it's true that a good firewall will alert on many of these attacks, it's equally important to keep those applications patched. You should also carefully consider and assess what needs to be publicly accessible. If a service doesn't need to be accessible publicly, I wouldn't suggest taking the risk.
Now, there might be some of you watching this who are using Snort 2 and haven't yet upgraded to Snort 3 and are yet to experience all the wonderful benefits that Snort 3 brings. So here are Nick and Brandon to tell you about the fundamental differences between Snort 2 and Snort 3.
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's important to note that Snort 3 is a complete rewrite of Snort 2. It's not just an update. It's completely written in C++. And that makes it, especially for enthusiasts, it's a lot more modular and easier to understand, right? And I think the next biggest thing would be Snort 3 is now multi-threaded. In the past, we had to, in Snort 2, if you wanted to spawn multiple Snort processes, you had to spawn one per core and assign it to a core. And that used a lot of memory because each of those needed its own config and needed to keep track of all the streams itself. And then now that's all shared across all of your Snort threads. And provides better memory utilization and performance right off the bat.
The architecture, the core, has, if you've seen a long-term technical project, especially if coming from a startup like Snort came from, there's a lot of technical debt, a lot of compromises that you have to make along the way, and Snort 3 is really about just thinking what would be the very best possible way that we could do this. And take the time to write the software to be incredibly fast, but also to be a dream for security researchers. It was written basically in cooperation every step of the way with Talos. So it has a better rules language. The syntax is cleaned up. It's much easier. It has things like service rules, which we can get into, which are amazing. File rules, different rule types. Has new and exciting rule options. It has a regular expression-based fast pattern engine called Hyperscan, which we're pretty excited about. We could go on and on, but those are the highlights for me.
Now, one of the very exciting things about Snort 3 is the extent to which you can customize it depending on your current needs or whatever experiments you fancy conducting. So here is Nick and Brandon's advice on how you can create custom plugins on Snort 3.
For custom plugins, so you have codecs that you can write for layer 2 stuff. You have inspectors that you can write, but Snort 3 also has something called a pub sub or a publish subscribe model. So certain inspectors can publish data that other inspectors can subscribe to. So if you wanted to build a URI block list, then you could build an inspector plugin that subscribes to the URI from HTTP inspect. So you sort of have this asynchronous communication between inspectors, and you can drop traffic based on your verdict inside that inspector. So it has this sort of data bus that each inspector can listen to and publish information on.
Yeah, plugins are, I think one of the best features of Snort 3. Brandon scratched over a lot of it, but on top of that, you can even write your own IPS options. So if you are a big rule writer, you could when we don't provide an option that you want to use in your own rules, you could write your own and plug it right in and write Snort rules with it. You could also write your own actions for how you want to handle the traffic that we alert on. And you can even make custom loggers. So if you have a particular product that you enjoy to get all of your security events in one place with, you could write a logger that it's compatible with your product and analyze it the way you want to.
And it doesn't have to be, plugins don't have to be written in C++. So you don't have to go that close to the metal. We also support LuaJIT, which is a scripting language, but it's a scripting language that gets JIT compiled to machine code. So it's a very fast execution time. So you can write your own rule options. You can write your own rule options in LuaJIT to do whatever you want to do, and then use those in Snort rules, regular Snort rules.
We want to make it as easy as possible for you to move from Snort 2 to Snort 3. So in the Snort 3 repository, we've included a tool that allows you to transfer all of your original configurations and rule sets over to Snort 3, all without you having to do anything or lose any of the detections that you previously had. It's all automatically transported. To find out more, head to talosintelligence.com/snort. Thank you for watching this episode of ThreatWise TV. Be sure to check out Ben's blog for even more in-depth research on this topic, and we'll be back with another episode very soon.